Hello everyone, welcome back to Education for Diversity. This week we've got two separate PowerPoints. Please make sure that you watch both of them. We're going to look first of all at the evidence around inclusive education and the impact that it has on outcomes for all students. And in the next PowerPoint that you watch, you're going to look at policy and how policy has developed over the years, particularly in relation to legislation. I'd like to start this presentation by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this beautiful country that we all live in, and for the knowledge and skills that they've displayed while looking after this amazing land. And I'd like to extend that acknowledgement to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people engaging with this presentation. As I've said, today we're looking at evidence and the evidence around inclusive education. Does it support inclusive education? Are there concerns about inclusive education? What effect does inclusive education have on outcomes for students? But while we're doing this, I want you to think, you probably have some ideas around inclusive education, about whether you support it, whether you don't support it, whether you support it with caveats. You think, well, it's kind of okay some of the time, but in this circumstance it wouldn't be okay. So I want you to really think about what your starting point is. And I also want you to think about, what are you basing that starting point on? Okay, so do we actually use evidence to support our practice and decisions about practice in schools? Do we really support it? Do we really use evidence? Or do we base our opinions on something else? One way to think about evidence is to think really, what is the purpose of school in the first place? Over the years of my life, certainly, there has become more and more an emphasis on the learnification of schools. That really the whole purpose of school is really just to churn out kids who know lots of stuff. But we might consider that there are actually other aims of education, and certainly if you talk to high school students or even primary school students, many of them really bemoan the fact that there's not more done to support well-being, and there's not more done to think about what kind of society we want to develop in future, what kind of social relations we want people to have. So you can look at inclusion as a sort of ideological perspective. What you're dealing with here is the purpose of schooling in a much broader sense. Okay, as we get into the nitty-gritty about outcomes and evidence, I will be using the term SEN or special educational needs in this presentation, because that's what the paper uses, and it would be just very confusing to keep moving away from that term. So when we're thinking about outcomes for students, we can think about the students who might not normally be included in mainstream schools, so students with special educational needs. And we need to think, is it unjust to stop students with special educational needs from accessing general mainstream education? And we might think, well, it would be unjust only really if their needs could be met in that situation. If they're not going to obtain at least as good an outcome in mainstream education as they would in a special school, then that may not be the best approach for them. And then we can also look at students without special educational needs. And do they benefit or not from being in inclusive education? Now, there are a lot of philosophical discussions that we could have around this. John Rawls, who was a very famous philosopher last century, would say that basically everybody has to have equal rights, not equal treatment necessarily, but equal rights. And the only reason that you would ever differentiate in terms of applying that rule is in order to benefit the weakest in society. So John Rawls would say, actually, it doesn't matter as much about the outcomes of students without special educational needs if what you are doing is helping students with special educational needs, whom John Rawls would have seen as the weakest in society. But whatever John Rawls thinks and whatever we think philosophically about that, let's look at the evidence and see if we even need to make that decision anyway. Well, let's start by looking at students with special educational needs. Do they benefit from inclusive education when compared with special schools or particular segregated settings? And it has been found in every single meta-analysis which has been performed and in many large-scale studies that students with SEN do benefit from inclusive education. Now, what is a meta-analysis? A meta-analysis is really a sort of statistical technique for combining qualitative and quantitative study data from several different studies so that you can develop a single conclusion. And it's much stronger than the analysis of any single study, because any single study could be unique to that area or might have just a few people involved in it, or it might be specific to a particular kind of people or whatever. But in a meta-analysis, you include data from many, many studies, and you establish, is there any statistical significance across a much broader population? And you get a much closer estimate of effect, magnitude, and you can examine subgroups with individual numbers that aren't statistically significant in other in individual studies. So, evidence of the benefits of inclusive education for students with special educational needs goes back decades, and Dunn's study in 1968 was quite a sort of seminal study. It really shocked people, I think, to discover that what they thought they'd been doing well for all these years actually didn't work as well as just educating people altogether. And the reason that Dunn looked at special education for the mildly retarded, as it was known then, is because students with more severe disabilities were not thought worthy of educating at all. So they weren't in any educational system. Okay, so the study, as I say, caused a bit of an outcry at the time, back in 1968, but every big study since, every meta-analysis since, has found the same result, that there are benefits to students with special educational needs. So If we choose not to educate students with special educational needs in inclusive settings, we have to ask, is that because we value them less than we value other students? Or do we have to ask that question? Because it may be that we don't actually have to make that choice, that we don't have to decide between students with special educational needs and students who don't have special educational need. There have been quite a few reviews of studies on this. Now, a review of studies is not a meta-analysis. That's just a look at many studies and see and talk about each study kind of individually, see what they bring. So it's not combining the results all together. It's just talking about a range of studies, having an overview, if you like, of a range of studies. And Raz and Florian found that the average school achievement in schools with a higher percentage of students with special educational needs is comparable to average achievement in schools without such students. And implementing inclusive practices on school level can lead to achievement improvement among all students when the growth of academic achievement is considered. So if you look at what they came in with and what they leave with, there's actually, they are saying that the evidence suggests that there is an improvement in the growth of academic achievement. Because one of the difficulties is that often, because many private schools, many selective schools and so on don't have inclusive environments, the overall achievement is higher in those schools. But when you look at the actual growth of academic achievement, because those students go in higher, they're from higher backgrounds that have higher education levels, higher resource levels and so on, those students in private schools and selective schools do better overall. So it appears, perhaps, that that it's better to not have such students. But when you look at the growth of academic achievement, what students come into school with and where they end up, it suggests that Rouse and Florian found by looking at lots of schools that, in fact, there is actually an improvement in achievement in inclusive schools. And similarly, Ainscow and Caesar in 2006 demonstrated that development of inclusive practices in schools is linked to the improvement of student results on achievement tests. Similarly, Kalambuka and colleagues looked, again, this is a review, not a meta-analysis, they just looked at 26 studies and they looked at academic outcomes. So I think, again, most people agree that there are good social outcomes for all students in inclusive environments, but they're looking at academic outcomes. And the reason people have started looking at academic outcomes is because the perception has been for a long time, yes, it might be good socially, but at what cost academically? So Kalambuka and colleagues looked at 26 studies, 21 of those were devoted to academic outcomes, and they found positive effects in 6 of the studies, negative effects in one study, and no effect at all in the remaining studies. So having students with special educational needs or not having them made no effect in the remaining studies. And they concluded that there's no relationship between the type of special educational needs. So people often say, yeah, well, that's okay, but what if you've got severe special educational needs? Are we just comparing, for example, dyslexic students with students who are kind of non-verbal on the autistic spectrum, perhaps? They found actually there's no relationship between the type of special education needs and classmates' academic achievement. But the study I really want to look at is this study by Zumsky and colleagues. This was published in 2017, And again, I say a meta-analysis is a technique for combining data from multiple studies on the same topic. So, as I say, to make a valid decision about using a particular approach or an intervention, we shouldn't rely on the results obtained from single studies, because they can vary from one study to another for various reasons. And there can be confounding factors and all sorts of things. So this study is a meta-analysis which combined individual studies, used a lot more data, and therefore the precision and accuracy of the estimates are better. So what method did they use? Well, they identified studies in English and German, and the reason they did that was because that was the languages they could speak. They examined the effects of inclusive education for students without special educational needs, and this was in particular in relation to academic outcomes. They searched keywords across academic, so to find the studies, they searched keywords across academic databases, and those keywords included things like inclusive education, mainstream education, effectiveness, co-teaching, achievement, school outcomes, and so on. And they included academic papers, doctoral theses, reports, and book chapters. And there are reasons that they chose each of those particular things. If you include only academic papers, there's a thing called publication bias, which means that things tend to get published if they have either a big effect or an unexpected effect. And so they also looked at doctoral theses, reports, and book chapters, because then those studies just report on whatever effects they've got, and they don't have any gateways to get through in order to disseminate their results to a wide audience. So what were the criteria for inclusion of studies in these analyses? Well, firstly, it was right across the whole of compulsory schooling, so from grade K to 12, so this includes secondary students. The studies had to include a quantitative measurement of academic achievement, and that couldn't be like a GPA produced by a school. It had to be standardized tests, some form of standardized testing, so that it could be compared. There was some kind of comparability. The measurement had to concern academic achievement in language, maths, science, biology, or a foreign language. I'm assuming they think biology is not a science in Germany or something, but there you go. And the study had to involve between group comparisons or longitudinal measurements. So they couldn't just look at inclusive education, they had to look at inclusive education and non-inclusive situation. And it had to provide an effect size. So when they'd gone through that very rigorous process of choosing studies, they started off with quite a few more, I think about 90, but they didn't all include the things I mentioned on the previous slide. They ended up with 47 studies that had quantitative achievement data that could, was a standardized, in relation to some kind of standardized measure. The studies were conducted between 1980 and 2012 in Europe, so Austria, the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, and the UK, and North America, Canada, and the United States. There was no Australian examples in there, but obviously Europe and the States. The studies in total, and this is a very important point, covered 4,800,000 K-12 students. Now bear in mind that the ABS estimate that at the moment in Australia, in 2018 in Australia, there were 3,893,834 K to 12 students in Australia. So we are talking here about more students. The studies altogether, the studies that were analysed in the meta-analysis, covered more students than all of the students that are currently in schools in Australia. And they didn't want to just get an overall result. They wanted to say what kind of factors might moderate the results. So they looked at the country of study. Was it Europe or was it US or Canada? And the reason for that is that in the US and Canada, inclusion is a much more holistic sort of thing, and I'll talk about that later. They also looked at the way inclusive education was implemented. Again, I'll talk about this later, but was the inclusion carried out with support from, for example, university faculties or local education authorities or an inclusive education specialist, or was it just regular school practice that included some children with special educational needs? They looked at the educational team composition. So a general education teacher, a GET, a general education teacher plus part-time special education teacher, or a sort of team of a general education teacher and a special education teacher full-time. They looked at the level of special educational needs, and this was like severe versus mild were the categories that they defined, and they suggested that severe special educational needs included those with multiple disabilities, moderate or severe intellectual disabilities. So they're saying it's severe special educational needs if they have even just moderate intellectual disabilities, or Down syndrome, or if students were on the autistic spectrum. Students with mild special education needs included those with just learning difficulties, specific learning difficulties, communication disorders, education and behavioural difficulties, sensory and motor disabilities, and mild intellectual disability. And then there was a type, they looked at type of SEN, so comparing students with educational and behavioural difficulties to all other students. And they also moderated educational stage, so elementary, lower secondary, or upper secondary. So the point of this is what they're saying is when we've got the full result, can we look more closely? For example, is it true that inclusive education might work in elementary schools but not in upper secondary schools? Does it work when there are students with severe levels of special education needs compared with if the needs are more mild? Okay, so bear in mind that to some extent they were expecting to find that the presence of students with special educational needs might impact on the academic achievement of students without special educational needs. And they analysed the data in two particular ways, and I don't want to get too involved with the statistics here because I know some of you will not be statisticians and might be confused a little bit by some of the stats, but there's two basic ways that they did it. One was with a free effects model and one was with a random effects model. They actually found that whichever way they analysed it, it gave exactly the same results. And the result was that the mean effect on the academic achievement of students without special educational needs in inclusive classrooms was positive and statistically significant, although it was weak. Okay, so it's a small, when we say weak, what we mean is the effect size is small. It doesn't make a huge difference, but the difference that it does make is positive. And it was actually statistically significant, which is often quite hard to get in experiments or analysis. So we've got an overall result showing that overall there is a positive, weak, statistically significant effect of having students with special educational needs in classrooms with students without special educational needs for all of the students, all of them, particularly the studies was looking at the students without special educational needs. We then start to break it down and say, okay, well, are there particular effects in different places? So they started by looking at country of study. They began by separating the countries into European countries and then the USA and Canada. The reason for doing that is that in the USA and Canada, inclusion is much more theorized, much better theorized. There is a philosophy behind it. There are lots of educational approaches to support it and a much stronger history of an inclusive culture. In Europe, not so much. What they call inclusion can be more like just teaching special students with special needs. So it's not well theorized and it's not always good practice. And what did they find? Well, the USA and Canada had a positive, weak, that just means, remember, a small effect. It's a positive effect, but it's not a huge impact, it's just a small impact. And statistically significant. Okay, so in the US and Canada, positive, fairly small effect, but statistically significant. In Europe, there was still a positive effect, and it was also small. It was smaller, in fact, than in the USA and Canada, but it wasn't statistically significant. So there was a difference between US and Canada and Europe, but both had a positive effect. Both were fairly small. It was statistically significant in the US and Canada, but not in Europe. Okay, so the studies that they looked at were of different types. In some of the studies, they just looked at some schools that had existing practice, inclusive practice, and some schools which didn't. That might be one study. In other studies, they looked at, okay, what happens if we start with a non-inclusive environment and we have an intervention? Perhaps we work with a university or other people and we bring in new practice which seeks to improve inclusion in this school. And so there are these different types of studies involved in the overall meta-analysis. They found that in schools where there were no changes to the regular practice, they were just comparing existing schools, some of which might already contain students with special educational needs, some which didn't. There was, again, a positive, very weak, but non-significant effect. So not much difference, very little difference between the schools that were inclusive and the schools that were not. But what difference there was just positive. In terms of experimental intervention schools, where they actually said, okay, we're going to do inclusion, we're going to make this school more inclusive, how can we do that? And actually looked at possible ways, good leadership, a range of ways that we'll be looking at in this unit. How can you make a positive intervention to improve the possible outcomes of inclusion if you move to an inclusive model? And they found, again, in that situation, that the outcomes for students were positive, weak, and significant. So having inclusive education and saying, yeah, you can't just say we're going to throw all these kids in together. You've got to have some things in place. You've got to have some strategies to make it work. When you do it that way, you get significant effects. And yes, it's still not a huge impact, but it is nonetheless positive and significant. Now, of the 40 plus studies, 47 studies, whatever it was, there was only one study which had only a general education teacher. All of the others either had a part-time special education teacher or a full-time special education teacher in addition to the general education teacher. And contrary to their expectations, they didn't find any difference between having a part-time or a full-time special ed teacher in there. So yeah, they expected that there would be a difference, but there wasn't a difference. Yeah. Okay, so just to remind you that we're always talking about the effects on students without special educational needs and their academic achievement. So another thing they looked at here was the level of needs that were held by that students, other students in those inclusive classrooms had, and to see if that had a different impact on the students without special educational needs. And there was a minor difference here, but it was marginal, it wasn't big. But when students were together with students with mild special educational needs, this was found to have a positive, statistically significant effect on the academic outcomes of students without special educational needs. If those same students were in a classroom together with students with severe special educational needs, then it had no impact at all on their, not positive, not negative, on the academic outcomes of students without special educational needs. And this is when compared to being in a classroom with no students with special educational needs. Okay, then they looked at the type of need that students had. There's a hypothesis that almost seems intuitive, that if students have emotional and behavioural difficulties and are disrupting the classroom because of that, that learning will be much harder for students without special educational needs. And so they looked at classrooms attended by students with emotional and behavioural difficulties, and classrooms without those students, and they might also have included students with disabilities, but not emotional and behavioural difficulties. And again, they found that there was no significantly different effect. There's no real impact. It didn't really make a difference whether they were students with emotional and behavioural difficulties or other special needs. And then they looked at the level of education, primary or secondary. And I think part of the reason for that is people often think, well, it's easy to do it in primary because all they do is learn to cut things out and that kind of thing. But we can't do it in secondary. We've got a curriculum to get through. We've got, all this content that we've got to teach. And yet, in elementary education, same thing, positive, a weak but statistically significant effect. In upper secondary education, so that's kind of year 9, I think, upwards. It's not the top layer. I think it's not the senior college part, but I think it was year 9 or 10, I can't remember. It was positive, it was weak, and it wasn't statistically significant. And in lower secondary education, it was positive, but it was very small. The impact was very small. So although, yes, it did do some good to have students with special educational needs, it did help the students without special educational needs, did have some positive impact, it was statistically non-significant. But look at that upper secondary education one. Again, positive and weak. So there's certainly no disadvantage to students with without special educational needs being in classrooms with students with impairments. And for those of you who like the numbers, here is a table of all of those results. Okay, so I started this talk by explaining to you that we know that students with SEN benefit from this form of education. We know that every meta-analysis ever done on this topic has shown that students with SEN benefit from being in inclusive classrooms. And I don't actually think it's that surprising. I think if you struggle with something, being around people who are competent in that particular thing is going to help you learn it. Just having it modeled to you day after day after day is going to help. That is one of the parts of teaching that we often don't really think about, that modeling aspect. So we started with that. We know that students with SEN benefit from this form of education. But this meta-analysis wanted to go beyond that, because they want the fear often among particularly parents of students who don't have special educational needs are like, oh my God, I can't have students in my class, in my child's class who have special educational needs because they will suffer from it. But that's not true. It's just not true. We had 4,800,000 students in these studies, and inclusive education is beneficial for students without SEN. I have said many times it is not a huge impact, but there is an impact, and it is positive. And certainly, even if something in your head is saying, I can't accept that, what you can say is there is absolutely no doubt that it's not a negative, definitely not a negative. It is statistically significant sometimes, not other times, pretty much always positive. Or I think there was the one case where it was just neutral. It is small, but it's positive. And then they looked at specific conditions of inclusive education implementation, the country, the type of need, and so on. And not in any of those did they find an effect with a statistically negative value. And one of the reasons might be to do with the way that the teaching is done. In classrooms where you are aware that you have to make a bit of an effort to differentiate, you have to think about controlling your task difficulty and allowing students to work at the level that they're working at. You might teach in small collaborative groups. You might think really carefully about the way that you question students to check that they're keeping up, that they know what's happening, and so on. Those things that work for students with special educational needs also work for students without special educational needs. So it's possible that the reason there is a positive effect is that teaching is just really well thought out when there are a range of students in the class. And I know that people often think, it's really good to have students of all the same ability, excuse me, in a class, because then you can teach to that level. There's never students of all the same ability, whatever we want to think that is, but there's certainly students are not always working at the same level. Even if they're generally a C in maths, they're not all working on every single topic at the same level. So we need to really think about, how do we make sure that every lesson is valuable to every child? And we do that by thinking really carefully about our teaching. Okay, so those are pretty compelling statistics. It does seem that on average, students without special educational needs do well in inclusive environments, that it's actually a positive thing for their academic outcomes. But they are statistics, and statistics take the experience of hundreds, thousands, in this case millions of students, and average them out. So we might think, let's look at some groups within the students who do not have special educational needs and think about, you know, do certain groups of those students have a sort of differential experience depending on whether they're in inclusive environments or not. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about schools in the next slide. The reality in terms of schools is that basically if you're gifted, you're going to do pretty well wherever you are. And certainly in life, it makes no difference whether you've been to a school for gifted students or not. And I say this as somebody who was identified as gifted and talented at my school. So this is not chip on my shoulder stuff or anything like that. But the reality is that basically in life, how well you do in life in terms of being gifted, and I can talk till the cows come home about whether gifted is a reasonable label or not, but certainly being high achieving, basically high achievers will go where they're going to go in life, regardless of what happens at school. But let's look at setting and streaming at the moment rather than separate schools for high achievers. And the evidence suggests that setting and streaming has a very small negative impact for low and mid-range attaining learners and a very small positive impact for higher attaining learners. That's what the Education Endowment Foundation says. So we're looking there at micro-exclusion, at separating people out on the basis of some kind of ableism really within schools. But I did say I'd look at schools, and in Hungary there are elite schools that are state schools, but they cherry pick their students from general primary schools. So they go around all the general primary schools and they look at who is performing at the highest levels and they take them off to the elite schools. What's interesting is, on average, the departure of those very highest achieving students has a negative effect on the students left behind, and the negative effects are largest for the highest achieving students that are left behind. So, you know, the ones who just didn't quite get the cutoff seems to be those who suffer the most from the loss of the highest achievers. And we might then think about, why is that? What is happening? Is there some kind of ceiling effect going on here, where the highest achievers are all, whatever level they're at, are always going to be held slightly down? So whether you cream off the top, the next lot will still be held slightly lower. If you cream off those lot, the next lot are going to have a negative impact. Is there some kind of ceiling effect? And if there is, what can we do about it? And we'll be talking about that later on in the unit. Okay, for now, that's it for this presentation. Please make sure you watch the next presentation about policy and legislation in relation to education.